What I'm about to show you is unquestionably an attack upon free speech in the United Kingdom. I'm quite alarmed by the questions asked in Parliament and further alarmed by the response by Keir Starmer. And it is, as I say, unquestionably an attack upon free speech, because it will, if they follow through with it, create blasphemy laws in the UK, which many people may not agree with and would certainly restrict free speech. So before we get any further, if I could again just ask you to please subscribe to my channel. That helps me grow. I am independent and I am going to remain so. So let's get into what I'm talking about here. So here we have a question in Parliament raised by Tahir Ali. Let's listen to the question. We'll listen to the response, and then I'm going to give you my views on it. I will try to mute myself successfully. Take a listen to this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. November marks Islamophobia Awareness Month. Last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran, despite opposition from the previous government. Acts of such mindless desecration only serve to fuel division and hatred within our society. Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions?
Can I agree with him that desecration is awful and I think should be condemned across the House? We are, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, committed to tackling all forms of hatred and division, including, of course, Islamophobia in all of its forms. Thank you.
And now just pausing for a moment, if we take the word desecration here. Now, let me just caveat the rest of this video by saying I don't condone hatred, inciting violence, obviously. But let's look at the word that we're talking about here. They're talking about desecration. Now, when we look at these things, we look at what is the ordinary dictionary meaning of these words and how does it apply, what are we talking about, and so on. So when we look at the ordinary dictionary meaning of the word desecration, we are talking about the action of damaging or showing no respect towards something that is holy or that is otherwise very much respected. And so if you showed by way of speech, by way of demonstration, for example, that you did not respect something that is holy, some kind of religion, that is what they're referring to here by way of desecration. Now, I'm not for a minute suggesting that that is a good thing, but that's not quite the point. Going back to what was suggested in the question, which Keir Starmer didn't really answer, but going back to the question was, will he commit to making it a prohibited act to desecrate some religious text? Let's go back to the video itself and we'll break down bit by bit what was said and what effect that would have if that were acted upon by this government. Let's take another listen.
Islamophobia Awareness Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran, despite opposition from the previous government. Acts of such mindless desecration only serve to fuel division.
Just pausing there. Acts of such mindless desecration. Now, first of all, it may not be mindless. It may be somebody that is expressing their view, which they are entitled to do. There are legal limits on free speech. There are limits on what and how someone is permitted to express and manifest their beliefs, but they are entitled to hold those beliefs and they are entitled to express themselves in very robust ways. To suggest that it is mindless is misleading, with respect, because it may not be mindless. Again, I'm not condoning the act of saying something hateful or hurtful or etc. This is purely a legal discussion here. But it may not be mindless. It may be quite mindful, in fact. They might put a lot of thought into what they say. Whatever religious text they're talking about, they might put a lot of research and thought into it, and they might be criticizing it for very valid reasons in their own mind, and they are free to express those opinions and those views, so it may not be mindless at all. But that's the suggestion here, so let's listen on.
And hatred within our society. Will the hatred within our nation only serve to fuel division and hatred within our society?
Now, again, picking up on that point, if someone were to have a very robust conversation, a debate on a religious text, and somebody makes a comment that they don't respect it, they don't approve of it, they don't agree with it, and so on, one might infer that that is desecration. However, that is a lively discussion, a lively debate. It is a free and democratic society. We have the option to express ourselves in that way. And the suggestion here by Tahir Ali is that that only serves to fuel hate and divide in society. Again, looking at this from another point of view, in fact, debate does bring parts of society together. Ironically, a debate can bring two sides together because they are bringing their opposing views together. That is exactly what Parliament is here. And so it's somewhat ironic that an MP stands up in Parliament to say that all discussion that is against a religious text should be prohibited, i.e. made an offence, when he stands here in Parliament, which is very much the place of debate in our country, where different and opposing views can and very much should be expressed so that they are representing the views of the people and the constituents around the country. But the suggestion here is that such discussion, such acts, desecration, to use the proper term, should be prohibited. And that obviously would derail and criminalise essentially a form of free speech. So let's dissect the rest of this once more.
Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions?
So let's break down the question. He asks, will the Prime Minister commit, i.e. will he make a promise, to taking measures, i.e. enacting legislation, which will prohibit, i.e. which will criminalise, all desecration, which will include any speech which is against, all religious texts, so the Bible, the Quran, etc., and the prophets of all of the Abrahamic religions. That includes Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So he's asking the Prime Minister, will he make it an offence to speak against any of these religious texts or prophets from any of these religions at all? That is very much an attack upon free speech. Now, again, I stress, I am not encouraging hateful, disrespectful speech and behaviour and so on. Certainly not that which incites hatred of any kind or religious hatred or inciting violence, of course. Of course, I don't condone those things. Those things are wrong. But merely to speak out against a religious text, if there is a law against that, that will be a law of blasphemy, as is quite rightly pointed out by Darren Grimes here. Darren Grimes says, Labour MP Tahir Ali calls for blasphemy laws in Britain. Free speech is under attack. He wants to criminalise the desecration of religious texts and prophets, aka blasphemy laws, by the back door. I would go further. I would say that that would be a blasphemy law. That would be a law that says you cannot and must not speak out against any religion. Darren Grimes goes on, Britain is a land of free speech, not a theocracy. We already have laws to protect people, not ideas. No one has the right to be offended, which is, of course, true. And Keir Starmer's response was actually quite broad, and I'm not sure that I agree with his response entirely. I do agree that we shouldn't be inciting hatred and inciting violence and so on, of course. But let's listen to precisely what he said in response.
Is awful and I think should be condemned across the House. I agree with him that desecration is awful and I think should be condemned across the House. We are, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, committed to tackling all forms of hatred and division, including, of course, Islamophobia in all of its forms.
Now, my problem with this response is that Keir Starmer appears to have conflated two different principles here. First of all, hatred and division, whilst it's certainly not something to aspire to, it's not necessarily something that should be criminalised, depending on how that manifests. If somebody simply says they don't like something and somebody else interprets that as hate, whereas it's not intended to be hateful, it's just intended to be that they don't agree, but in a strict form, that might be desecration. If somebody shows that they don't respect a text, they're not legally required to respect that text, but if they were to say that they didn't respect the text, one might infer or take the view that that's desecration. They may take the view that that is hateful. That is not necessarily a criminal thing, and should not be, I suggest, a criminal thing. But Keir Starmer suggests, it appears, that he's taking hate and division as a direct result of anything that is desecration. But that is not necessarily the case, because, as I say, desecration, by its ordinary dictionary meaning of the word, is not necessarily hateful or sowing division. It is merely, or perhaps, showing no respect towards something that is holy. Now, one is not obliged to show respect to something merely because it is holy. For example, if one considered themselves to be an atheist, then they should not be compelled to show respect to something that is holy. In fact, take flag burning or flag desecration by way of example. There is no such law in the UK of flag desecration that makes this an offence. Indeed, there is no blasphemy law making blasphemy an offence in the UK either. But this is essentially what this would amount to, and this would be going back on old law, which I can point you back to here, which is the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act of 2008, Section 79. If I move this so you can see it a little bit better. Section 79, the abolition of common law offences of blasphemy and blasphemous libel. The offences of blasphemy and blasphemous libel under the common law of England and Wales are abolished. In Section 1 of the Criminal Libel Act of 1819, the words any blasphemous libel are omitted. In Section 3 and 4 of the Law of Libel Amendment Act of 1888, the words blasphemous or are omitted. And subsections 2 and 3 and related repeals at Schedule 28 to extend to England and Wales only. And so you can see there that we did have blasphemy laws, we did have offences, common law offences of blasphemy, and those were abolished. We moved on, to coin a phrase. Now, as I say, I'm not condoning disrespect. I'm certainly not condoning disrespectful actions. But there are certain ways that we are permitted to express ourselves, provided that that is within certain boundaries, certain reasonable boundaries in an objective sense. Now, this is not to be confused with hate offences and hate crimes. There's been a lot of talk of hate crimes just recently. Now, a hate crime in and of itself would need to have an underlying offence which is motivated by some form of hate or prejudice of some kind. For example, if an offence of assault were committed simply because somebody had a protected characteristic, whether they were from a particular race or religion, a particular sex, gender, or whatever, or sexual orientation perhaps, if an offence of an assault was motivated by one of those protected criteria, then that would make it a hate crime, and it is dealt with, quite rightly, severely. And in fact, there are sentencing guidelines that deal with these offences very much more seriously in that way because they are motivated by hate and prejudice. That is right. However, coming back to the issue of free speech, one is entitled to express their thoughts and feelings and even manifest their thoughts, feelings and beliefs in a certain way, up to the point where such words or behaviour or materials displayed become threatening and they are intended thereby to stir up religious hatred. That obviously then becomes an offence. I say obviously, it may not be obvious, but it is an offence. Under the Public Order Act of 1986, it was inserted by, I believe, the Racial and Religious Hatred Act 2006, inserted the offence of stirring up religious hatred. And that is where a person has the use of words or behaviour or display of written material, and the person who uses threatening words or behaviour, and the key there really is threatening, or displays any written material, which is threatening, is guilty of an offence if he intends thereby to stir up religious hatred, or hatred on the grounds of sexual orientation. And so the problem that we have here is if they made a law that said it is now an offence to desecrate any religious text or prophet and so on, then we would have to get into, well, what do we mean by desecrate? Does it simply mean that you say you don't believe in a certain text? Because many people don't. If that was then an offence to say that you don't believe in that text, that is absolutely an infringement upon free speech. merely because you are not respecting that religious text. Because a lack of respect for something is not automatically hateful and hurtful and sowing divide and so on, as has been suggested here. It may simply be that somebody doesn't agree with it, and therefore they are saying they don't agree with it, and therefore somebody may infer that that is a lack of respect. If that was then intertwined and caught up in the definition of desecration, which becomes an offence, then it becomes an offence to say what you think. And unless it's intended and is threatening with the intent of stirring up racial hatred, that is not, as it stands, an offence. So this very much would be an erosion of free speech. And I think that's going in the wrong direction. Now, as I say, I've said many times, my job as an advocate is to give you both sides here, is to give you a way to think about things. Every time I say something, every time I make an argument about something, it's not necessarily that I agree with those arguments. And I try to give you both sides of these things. And of course, I don't agree with being intentionally hostile towards anybody. I certainly wouldn't. Whether I believed personally, this is my personal opinion, I feel it necessary to say this here. If I didn't agree with something, personally, I wouldn't say that I didn't agree with something. I would respect it, and I would show respect for it, whether I believed it or not. And I believe that other people should do that. But I also believe, because I'm an advocate, I do believe that this has to be equal and balanced. And I believe that just because one person wouldn't do that doesn't mean that somebody else isn't or shouldn't be permitted to say those things, just because someone else might find them offensive or disrespectful. Because if we really go down the line of criminalizing words of disrespect, then we really are going to end up in a society where you are just not free to say what you think. And that is not the society, quite frankly, that I grew up in. And so, as I say, I'm not condoning hateful speech, hateful behavior, even if it doesn't cross the criminal threshold, even if it is just normal speech and espousing views. But at the same time, I have to argue that we need to maintain free speech in this country. But as I say, you can let me know what you think in the comment section below. Of course, you need to bear in mind the criminal threshold, because you can say what you think, but up to a point where it crosses that criminal threshold. And we have set those lines in criminal law. There are certain lines and boundaries that you cannot and must not cross. And people that do often find themselves prosecuted and they end up going to prison. So, as I say, let me know your thoughts below. But bear in mind those thresholds, because this is possibly a dangerous, slippery slope. So let me know your thoughts. Please do like the video and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.